I believe that the real significance of what we have started here today is that we have laid the groundwork for the building of a functioning, broad coalition of Americans from all walks of life, from all points of view, from all races and creeds and color, who can carry on not only the common struggle to achieve an effective and meaningful civil rights legislation, but who can do this practical work, the day-to-day job of fighting discrimination in education, in housing, in employment, in public accommodation. And I think this is the true significance of what we have started today.
All right, so Tom Leslie in the fall of 1964 came to Mercersburg. He was not the only African American when he arrived in the fall of 1964. He was joined by two other black students, Conrad Vickers, class of 68, and Tom Fleming, class of 68.
There was never a big deal made of Tom coming to the school. I remember that we were back for preseason football, and I don't think he came back at the start of it. I think he came back sometime during the initial week of preseason. And I can kind of remember seeing a black guy run onto the field suited up, and that was kind of his entrance. The coach said, you know, get in line and join the group for calisthenics, which he did.
I did know one guy who said in the gymnasium that his parents would never have let him come here if they would have known he was going to be integrated, and he did leave. I can't remember whether he left at the end of the year or whether he left at Christmas vacation. I think it might have been Christmas vacation. He was from Georgia, though, so.
Did that feel fairly isolated?
Oh, yeah, I think there was probably 3 or 4 more students that didn't come back at the end of the year, the next year. But.
So when Tom was a student on campus, he lived in the 88 dormitory. Both years he was here. He was an 11th grader, and he was a football player.
Tom and I were roommates our upper middle year, junior year, and we still were close friends. And then we also, our senior year, we played football. I'm pretty sure he's on the wrestling team. I know he's on the lacrosse team.
It was interesting. I can remember they certainly didn't cut him any slack on the football team. Nobody gave him an easy ride. I remember him as a certainly better than average athlete. And I remember that after about 2 or 3 days, he became one of the guys and just kind of melted into the group.
The very first football game we played was a scrimmage against Shippensburg. Then it was called State Teachers College, and that meant that that's a freshman college team playing a prep school. So there are some class issues there. Somebody else was going to get the ball and run, and all of a sudden the 4 or 5, I can't remember exactly, Shippensburg players run straight to Tom and start a fight with him. And I heard the word nigger for the first time by a white, you know. And so we had a little riot. They removed both teams. We went in to our dressing rooms. The referees came in and lectured us and so forth. And so we went out and finished the game. Well, I never knew until trying to get more information about the Randolph-Macon game.
I was playing football for RMA in the fall of 1964 when Tom Leslie, the first black student at Mercersburg, came to Randolph-Macon to play football against us. As a student, I had no idea. I don't recall anybody talking about the fact that Mercersburg had a black player. I can't recall who won the game. I'm sure it was RMA. But we did not, there was no talk of it. For a student, it was a non-issue. At that time, RMA was all white, had never had a black student. So the immediate response from probably Colonel Boggs, but for those in charge, was get in touch with Mercersburg and tell them not to bring the black player. Well, Mr. Leonard Plants was the AD here at Mercersburg, and he said, well, that's not going to happen. So they're kind of negotiating back and forth. And the next challenge was that they said, well, bring him with your team, but he can't play. And Mr. Plants talked to the head of school here, Mr. Fowl, and they talked it all over, and they said, well, no, that's not going to happen. If Tom can't play, we're not coming. But it was Saturday morning before RMA told Mercersburg, okay, you can come. So we played the game. As I said, I played. No idea. There was no talk of what you could think could happen. Let's get that black guy, you know, let's hit him hard, let's get him out of the game. None of that. Could something have been said or something happen among 2 or 3 people, 6 people, 8 people off somewhere else? Yes, that could have happened. But there was no brawl. There was no animosity.
What I really like about the Tom Leslie story is throughout all of his trials and tribulations, Mercersburg stood by him through it all. When we traveled to Randolph, Macon, and they didn't want to play with Tom Leslie, Leonard Plants stood with Tom, wouldn't let us compete unless we were with Tom was among the group.
My father was, of anything else, was a real gentleman. And he was known for his goodwill among other schools when he was the athletic director and such. So then he always took care of the athletes. He always made sure if they were from someplace they could swim after a football game and all kinds of stuff. And they made sure they got special meals in the dining hall. And he shepherded them around until they left, came until they left. And
anybody that could come to Mercersburg and be the first Afro-American here took a mantle of great weight on their shoulders, and he took it very gracefully. Although I certainly wasn't at it, I know about the football games down in Virginia that must have been very traumatic, and yet returning from it, it was as if nothing had ever happened.
There are some trials that students of color face on campus, but the trials and tribulations that Tom faced were far much greater, and the fact that he did it all alone, away from his mom, who was a single mom and very distant from his life, and a father he did not know. He was still able to win the John Mountain Prize for Poetry. He was able to be a dorm proctor. He was able to be a member of the 15. Tom came in 1964, 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education was passed. He came in 1964, which was the same year that the Civil Rights Act was passed, and just a year before was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And so when he enters a white atmosphere at just the tender age of 17, of course he's gonna have a lot of weight to carry on his shoulders.
I don't remember of protests here like we're going on at other schools, and we knew about it. I mean, at television, you knew what was on the news and what was happening when people protested the Vietnam War and our veterans came back, and they were yelled at as women killers and baby murderers, and they were spit on. We saw that and knew that was going on, and that was the reception. There was a draft for the military then. People were running out of the country, many of them gone to Canada in order to avoid the draft. So there were things going on, but we didn't I don't remember that much.
How much pressure did Tom carry on his shoulders? When did that pressure begin to need release? He was the first Afro-American student at Mercersburg. I can't imagine the pressure that in and of itself carried. He sat on a football team, played on a football team where the other team refused to take the field. He was a member of that team. That team, our team stood around him. Our athletic director refused to not let Tom play, made sure he had to play. I can't imagine the pressure that in and of itself put on Tom. He goes to an Ivy League school. Ivy League schools in 1966 were not proliferate with Afro-Americans. It was beginning to change, but again, what's the pressure?
My name is Tom Newby. I was a classmate of Tom Leslie. What I considered, he considered, to be a good friend while we were in school together, while we played football together, and as when we went off campus to do things together, we were friends. We were passing through New York City. It was one of the breaks, I believe it was probably early 1966, our graduation year. It would have been early in the springtime at one of the breaks. We were in the village going from club to club, enjoying it, having a nice time, a pleasant time in the evening. We got on to we went to the subway. I forget where we were going from there, probably to a hotel. And when we got down on the subway platform, when the train was coming in to the station, Tom had a breakdown. I looked at him and he was glazed. And at that time, he then began to throw himself against the wall, body and shoulders, then practically throwing himself to the ground, then back up, throwing himself against the wall, making painful sounds. The subway policeman from up the room, we were holding him down on the ground. He wasn't violent towards other people. He was being more violent to himself, if anything. But glazed and roaring. They brought medics in. We were treated quite well. I rode in the ambulance with him, and we spent the night in a psychiatric ward of a hospital. I know they gave him injection and interviewed him in the morning, and we left with some paperwork. And at that time, they didn't address things the way they do now. And we went on our way and went to New Haven and visited his son from there.
Tom and John Verstandig graduated from Mercersburg in the spring of 1966. After that, they both were headed off to the University of Pennsylvania, where Tom would become a member of the football team and meet Mark Warner.
My name is Mark Warner, and I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 1970. Tom and I were both members of the Penn football team. Mm-hmm. And we became fast friends because we were both had starting positions in the backfield. He was a running back and I was a fullback. He was extremely gifted. As a matter of fact, it wouldn't be a stretch for me to say that he was the most athletic member of our freshman team, and I believe we went undefeated. So yeah, I can remember just I guess little anecdotal kinds of things. I was kind of Mr. Inside and he was Mr. Outside. I used to run the ball between the tackles, and then my other job was to, when he ran a sweep, I would lead the way and try to block as many guys out of the way as possible. And I oftentimes would just literally see Tom jump over me and the other guys that were trying to tackle him and zigzag his way downfield. He's clearly the fastest person on the field at all times. I can say that if Tom continued to play throughout his career and dedicated himself to it, he probably would have been the most valuable player in the Ivy League. The only other player my personal assignment is Calvin Hill. I don't know if you ever heard of Calvin Hill. He was Grant Hill's father. He played for Yale, and he was the Rookie of the Year in the NFL in 1967. Okay, 1969. He was a year older than us. He was 6'5", 230 pounds. Tom was at least as good as him.
Tom dropped out. Tom came back. We all believed there were drugs involved. We all believed there was, when I say all, I speak for those of us who were in the fraternity that knew him, we all believed that there was a level of trauma that had taken place with regard to the freshman football team. He was without question one of the two most outstanding athletes on it, but something happened when he came back in the second year and was going to play varsity football. I'm sure other people have given you more specifics. I couldn't tell you what it was, but you could see that something triggered. And gradually Tom left school for one period, came back, and then Tom was gone.
When we were sophomores at camp, we both thought that we were going to be the starting backfield for the varsity in our sophomore year. But what the coaches decided to do is to take all the best players and put them on defense. So I remember seeing that look on Tom's face, like he had almost dedicated himself to, his accomplishments and his abilities as a running back. And here he was now, he was playing cornerback. He knew that the coaches were probably trying to win the game defensively, and they already had like an offensive system in play, and it would be easier for him to just they inserted me as a middle linebacker, and they put him as a cornerback, and I could tell he was not happy. He was just not happy. He wanted his hands on the ball. He wanted to be, scoring, and evidencing his tremendous talent as a running back. So it must have been hard for him. And I really feel like I used to think, as a kid, that was the reason why he kind of just fell off the cliff after our sophomore season and never showed up again. He didn't even show up to camp in our junior year. He was already gone. So who knows what happened after football season? He was kind of let down. He was like, if I have to play defensive back for the next 3 years, next 2 years after this isn't how I see myself. So maybe he decided to, go down a different path, and he's influenced by other folks that he met. I don't know where Tom may have gotten his hands on some LSD, and I don't know who he was hanging out with at the time. But clearly, when I saw him, first of all, just get this vision. We've got this guy who's about 6'1", 210 pounds of muscle, and really handsome, kind of like Harry Belafonte handsome. He definitely had, movie star kind of looks, Tom did. And his smile was so contagious. So anyway, he went from that, and we played together for 2 years. And then when I saw him in his junior year and he didn't go out for the team, he was wearing, and it was late fall, he was wearing a long sort of Chesterfield overcoat. And he had those kind of circular glasses that folks used to wear. I don't even know if he needed glasses. We're both pretty big dudes. I was bigger than he was. I'm pretty lean myself right now, but I used to be, 6 foot 220. So, he was very thin. By the time I saw him as a junior year, he was, he looked like a normal kid on campus, and very affable, like I said. He would look everybody in the eye and give a smile. But now he was kind of looking inwardly. I could see it, and maybe that's why he was wearing the circular glasses that he had. I don't know, but and the long coat that he had. It may have been just shielding some of what was going on with him.
Even though we didn't talk about race, there was a sensitivity to Tom. You can see in his poetry and the way he saw life. It was something beautiful
to know about LSD since that time is that one of my, when I was in grad school, one of my colleagues said to me, LSD actually makes you believe that more than one reality exists. Okay, so Tom had kind of a dual reality, I think, really, at this point. You know, his experience as an athlete, his experience at Mercersburg, his experience growing up wherever he was, and then now being immersed into this other world. Mm-hmm. And there was one particular verse of scripture in the Sermon on the Mount that I think really captures what may have been going on with Tom. And it goes like this. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is clear, or spiritually perspective, you're shaking your head like you know the scripture. Spiritually perceptive, your whole body will be full of light, right, benefiting from God's precepts. Mm-hmm. But if your eye is bad, or spiritually blind, your whole body will be full of darkness, devoid of God's precepts. So if the very light inside your inner self, your heart, your conscience is darkness, how great and terrible is that darkness? So I think what was happening with Tom is after taking LSD, his senses became heightened to all of the evil he saw everywhere. Mm-hmm. And he was losing a grip with what, quote unquote, was real and what wasn't, what was, you know, a reality that he was creating for himself. And it's hard to argue whether or not Tom was delusional or just super sensitive to life's apparent injustices, which he clearly began to internalize. But now, since Tom's were, I'm going to have to just say spiritually bad because of taking LSD, and that he turned to drugs, he just became, the other side of that became unavailable to him. And his revelation of life was channeled through a terribly darkened inner self. I mean, he couldn't deny and certainly not embrace the racist climate that he encountered, even though the social and physical gifts that graced him enabled him to navigate this treacherous landscape of personal identity. I think Tom perceived his identity crisis as a lie that actually plagued and clouded his view of himself. And those who were seemingly blind to the truths about life that seemed out of his reach.
In my heart, I believe Tom had an undiagnosed mental condition that in these days would be noticed and diagnosed. And from what I hear situationally, it was aggravated by some things as time went by. I think he suffered from a mental condition. In fact, I know he did. I witnessed it. And some situations in his life, family life, and other things may have triggered the breakdown that I experienced, and it was indeed a breakdown. So maybe some other things came along when he was at Penn that started triggering him in other ways and bringing on recurring mental problems, which he most certainly had.
Years later, I understood that he had been working in a cardboard factory, and it was my understanding, which may or may not be true, that perhaps somebody was killed, and that Tom was incarcerated, I actually think in Massachusetts, not in Connecticut.
And I talked to his sister and said, how's Tom going? Like, where is he? So I can call over. She just told me he's in the Boston Mental Health Hospital. So I just decided to go see him on vacation as soon as I could, because he was obviously not doing well. Well, there's two parts to visit. I don't know if you've ever been to a mental hospital, but this is a public mental hospital for people that don't have much money. So these are, you walk in. I remember a man sitting on the floor, naked, legs spread apart, twirling his shirt in one direction, twirling it the next, just that's that's what he's doing. When I came out, he's doing the same thing an hour later. People screaming, people mumbling themselves. So to go into that kind of environment is a complete sort of shock to the system. So when it took me back to Tom, he was in I would almost describe it as a cell. It was a private room, very small, with a bed, maybe a chair. It was minimal. It was not a luxury place. It was just a compartment for him to stay. And we chatted for a while, and it was difficult, but he didn't tell me why I was there or anything else. Well, I think he mentioned, because this is the only way I could have known it, that he'd used some LSD. And after that, he flipped out, and he didn't say he lost sense of reality, but he was off as far as what was real, a little bit. The conversations were normal, we talked about that. He bloated up. He was being sedated. So he was unemotional, which is unusual for him, and not very animated in any way whatsoever. But we had a normal conversation.
And I received a couple of letters from Tom. They were as if written by a 5-year-old. And I wrote, and his mother wrote me. She seemed to recognize that he would never be released from incarceration. And the last letter I had from her was asking that if possible I could try to make sure that Tom was well taken care of.
It was the second time where things had gone down, what I consider went down dramatically, and drove up. So that'd be 71. He had put up more weight, and he was argumentative about the reality that life. I said, Tom, what are you doing to get out? He said, nothing. It's no different out there than it is here. Life is no better out there than it is here. So to me, that was really, really sad that he had lost the perception of goodness of life and the opportunities to make, freedom to work, to play, to associate, to visit, to love, all those things. He was happy or content not to have. And it was really discouraging, that second visit with Tom. It was like, why? He doesn't have any connection with anything outside.
So you didn't, unfortunately, have a chance to go visit him at the mental hospital at all?
I didn't try. I didn't try because if you had read the letters that I got from him, I didn't know that he could communicate. I assumed that drugs had taken such a terrible toll on him that he wasn't the person I knew. And candidly, I don't know that I had the courage.
So when did you learn about his death?
Gee whiz, not until about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. There was no contact at all. So I think I heard about it just like a memorial to Tom Leslie on one of the donation things. Okay.
Of course, he's gonna have a lot of weight to carry on his shoulders, but from the alums that we've spoken to, he's obviously had such a great impact on their lives that I'm talking about his legacy 55 years later, and they're still passionate people who still think about him every day and who still want to honor his life.
I remember Tom, who was a young man who would walk into the room and people would take notice. He was a gifted individual. He was a good student, intelligent. He had a beautiful personality. He had charisma. He projected himself, people, and he was a memorable man, a gifted young man.
Well, I think, first of all, Tom, as you probably heard from many, was extremely winsome. Very likable, affable. He had a good sense of humor, although he really did not talk a lot, but you could tell he was paying attention.
He had a twinkle to his eye, a quick smile, good looking, intelligent, fun to be with. Those kind of personality traits. He was just he's positive and friendly.
It was what was he when we were with him. And what he was Tom Leslie. And from that, we feel the lesson. And I asked Walter this, I've asked as many black people as I can, that the success of someone who has been included into a different environment is not necessarily how successful they become. Because to me that sounds patronizing. The degree of success is how many people's lives did that person or those persons touch and improve their lives.
I've said this before. If you take a can of white paint, it's pure, it's white. If you take an eyedropper, and from that eyedropper, just a small drop of blue paint or red paint enters into that mass of white paint, two things happen. The drop of colored paint is diluted and is never the same. And the can of white paint, every atom in it is changed and is never the same. Tom Leslie entered Mercersburg Academy, and whether the other 500 students realized it or not, they were changed for life. And Tom was changed for life. He was a very courageous person.